Okay. So, we are in Ephesians. That's fine. Ephesians chapter 4. And tonight we're really going for it. We're going to do verse 17 through to and including verse 20, which I shall read out to you. So, Ephesians 4 verse 17. This I say therefore, and testify in the Lord, that ye henceforth walk not as other Gentiles walk, in the vanity of their mind, having the understanding darkened, being alienated from the life of God through the ignorance that is in them, because of the blindness of their heart, who, being past feeling, have given themselves over unto lasciviousness, to work all uncleanness and greediness, but ye have not so learned Christ. So of course Paul's letter to the church at Ephesus, which we call Ephesians, is to Gentiles, but now of course he starts to draw a distinction between Christian Gentiles and pagan Gentiles, and he calls, in this instance, the pagan Gentiles, he calls them other Gentiles, and that the way that they walk or live is in vanity or the futility of their mind. That's what it really means. The vanity, the emptiness, empty, futility. These are the kind of words that you would substitute for vanity. So in Proverbs it says vanity of vanities, all is vanity, all is futile, right? Having their understanding darkened. So in other words, they've lost the knowledge of God, and because of that, their minds are just kind of wandering aimlessly, lacking focus on the true object of worship, which of course is God. So it's quite a good way to describe the Gentiles who aren't saved, who aren't walking in Christ, is that they walk in the vanity of their minds, in that kind of futile thinking. They're trying to kind of fix on something, but the one thing they should be fixing on, which is God, is not there anymore. They've not retained that knowledge, and we read a lot about this in the book of Romans, don't we? Romans chapter 1. Let's take a look. So Romans 1 and verse 21, which of course is talking about Gentiles, because that when they knew God, they glorified him not as God, neither were thankful, but became vain. Remember that word, vanity, vain, in their imaginations, and their foolish heart was darkened. So that's just another way of saying what Paul's saying here in Ephesians, isn't it? That Paul says in Ephesians that they walk in the vanity of their mind, having their understanding darkened. Here in Romans it says that because they knew God but they didn't glorify him as God, that they became vain in their imaginations and their foolish heart was darkened. So basically the same sort of thing is what it's saying. Once they no longer gave God his rightful place, although they knew God, they knew there was a God, instead they kind of put that to one side, and as a result of that their minds are darkened. And we as a family were looking in Proverbs this morning, about not Proverbs, 1 John it was, where it talks about God is light and in him there is no darkness. And I was saying darkness in scriptural terms has to do with ignorance, it has to do with sin, and both of those ideas or words are what we can put together here as we describe the Gentiles who don't have Christ. Is they're living in ignorance and they're living in sin, and the reason is because they have rejected the one true God. So it's important to understand sort of historically the evolution of belief, and that's not a reference to Charles Darwin. So in fact you might call it the devolution of belief. So like if you read a book on religion, quite often they'll tell you that how we came up with believing in one God was that originally, primitive man believed in different spirits, controlling the weather, controlling a spirit of a spirit of the rivers, a spirit of the volcano, or whatever. And then these spirits became gods, and then they had names, and then the witch doctors became priests, and then religion became more and more sophisticated until they progressed from many gods to one god. And that sounds quite, reasonable. Unfortunately, it's not true. The Bible shows us that from the very beginning, man believed in one true God, right, the creator of all things. But then when mankind fell into sin, that sin gave rise to idolatry and to the worship of many gods. And that was the process. So it's important to recognize that when you come to the Bible, particularly if you read Genesis and the early part of the Old Testament, you can see that is the case. That first of all, God is there; He has His rightful place, and then as time goes on, it's this kind of downward trajectory where there's worship of idols and so on. But Paul describes it, I think, really clearly. As we read on in Romans chapter 1 verse 22, professing themselves to be wise, they became fools, this is the Gentiles, and changed the glory of the uncorruptible God into an image made like to corruptible man, and to birds and four-footed beasts and creeping things. Wherefore God also gave them up to uncleanness through the lusts of their hearts, to dishonour their own bodies between themselves, who changed the truth of God into a lie, and worshipped and served the creature more than the Creator, who is blessed forever. Amen. So you can see, and I've said this before, there's this definite connection between false gods, idolatry, and immorality. Immorality, debauchery, and so on. There's this connection between the two. So because of their sin and their idolatry and their lust, the pagan Gentiles have become ignorant of God, and, to quote Ephesians 4 again, alienated from the life of God through the ignorance that is in them because of the blindness of their heart. So again, all the way through the scriptures, we see this idea of a darkened mind, a mind that is blind to God, that can't see God, is connected with paganism, idolatry, and immorality, and it is preceded, as Paul has made clear in Romans, by this rejection of the true God. They knew there was the true God, they knew there's one God, but it is a deliberate rejection. It's not that they started out not knowing God, and therefore they tried to make the best of, I don't really know what, I can't make sense of the natural world, therefore we come up with all these different spirits, and then we'll try and give names to them. No, that's not what happened. What happened was they had the one true God, they rejected that God, and therefore then they became idolaters. And we can see that process, the rejection of God, and then therefore the filling of that gap with idolatry and then immorality. You can see it clearly if we turn to Exodus 32. Just remember that process: rejection of God, and then idolatry, and then immorality. So Exodus 32. Exodus 32 and verse 1. And when the people saw that Moses delayed to come down out of the mount, so this is where Moses goes up to receive what we call the Ten Commandments. When the people saw that Moses delayed to come down of the mount, the people gathered themselves together unto Aaron and said unto him, Up, make us gods which shall go before us. For as for this Moses, the man that brought us out of the land of Egypt, we wot not, we know not, what is become of him. And Aaron said unto them, Break off the golden earrings which are in the ears of your wives, of your sons, and of your daughters, and bring them unto me. And all the people brake off the golden earrings which were in their ears, and brought them unto Aaron. And he received them at their hand, and fashioned it with a graving tool, after he had made it a molten calf. And they said, These be thy gods, O Israel, which brought thee up out of the land of Egypt. And when Aaron saw it, he built an altar before it. And Aaron made proclamation and said, Tomorrow is a feast to the Lord. And they rose up early on the morrow, and offered burnt offerings and brought peace offerings. And the people sat down to eat and to drink, and rose up to play. In other words, they rose up to be riotous, to indulge in debauchery and so on. And you can see there, Aaron says, tomorrow is a feast to the Lord, is a feast to Yahweh. And who are they celebrating? The idol they've made. So they've literally replaced the true God with this idol, this golden calf. And again, you can just see that process, can't you? Rejection of the true God, replacement with an idol, and then the subsequent lasciviousness and uncleanness and so on, which Paul is going to talk about in a minute in Ephesians chapter 4. So in the Old Testament, the Lord, Yahweh, is represented as Israel's husband. So let's have a look at that. It's in Isaiah. It's in a few places actually, but I think it's very clear in Isaiah. Isaiah 54. So it's Isaiah 54, and it's in verse 5. For thy Maker is thine husband. I can't get much clearer than that. Thy Maker is thine husband, the Lord of hosts is his name, and thy Redeemer, the Holy One of Israel, the God of the whole earth shall he be called. So there's this idea that there's an idea here of what we might call spiritual adultery, going after other gods, leaving the true God, who's Israel's husband, and then they go after other gods. That's kind of like adultery, isn't it? And what we find is that this spiritual adultery tends to lead to actual marital adultery and fornication. Therefore, it's not a surprise to me that those engaging in the spirit of that sin, it brings forth fornication. Just flicking back to Ephesians 4, you can see this kind of this spirit of which I'm speaking. Verse 19, who being past feeling have given themselves over unto lasciviousness to work all uncleanness with greediness. So yeah, there's this kind of lustful, unclean debauchery which is going hand in hand with this idolatry. And this is how Paul is describing the Gentiles. And of course, Ephesus and around this region, which is sort of, all these churches kind of around Greece and Turkey, that sort of area. Really at that time in ancient Greece, it would be nothing for a wealthy person to have a husband or a wife, plus a concubine, plus a same-sex concubine as well. I mean, they were living really quite openly in this way, and this is why Paul is characterizing really what he calls the other Gentiles, in other words, Gentiles who are not Christians, as living in this way. And he's pointing out the differences between Gentiles who become Christians and Gentiles who don't have salvation and don't know God. So again, there is a parallel running here, I think, with Romans chapter 1. In fact, you could almost say that Ephesians 4 and Romans chapter 1 kind of work together to give us, a full or a clearer picture of what Paul's talking about. So Romans chapter 1, verse 26. For this cause God gave them up unto vile affections, for even their women did change the natural use into that which is against nature. And likewise also the men, leaving the natural use of the woman, burned in their lust one toward another, men with men, working that which is unseemly, and receiving in themselves that recompense of their error, which was fitting. So, yes, their minds have been darkened, they're now ignorant of the truth. So they not only excuse these things that they do, but they're actually championing and celebrating them, and they work all uncleanness with greediness. So in other words, they not only do they do it, but they want more and more. There's a phrase that is used here, that's used in Ephesians, which says, let me have a look. Yeah, who being past feeling. So in other words, they have, not only have they kind of their minds darkened, but even their conscience now is past feeling. In other words, it's not troubled at all by such things, where at one time their conscience would convict them because they've continually hardened their heart against it, and because they continually push God out of their mind. Now they're past feeling. It's like, we might even say past caring. It's like it doesn't trouble them anymore, just because when you continually harden your heart against God, your conscience no longer works properly. Your conscience is no longer functioning as it should be, and that is why they're able to do the things that they do, and just continue, in sin with no kind of fear of what is it where they say, sinning without impunity, without any fear of judgment, because the thing that should have warned them, their own conscience, is now so hardened that it is past feeling. So in other words, they've given themselves over to it. Lasciviousness, by the way, implies all forms of impurity, and they have given themselves over, as it says in Romans, and they want more and more of these kind of sins. But verse 20 of Ephesians 4 just clarifies it, and I can't think in a way of a clearer verse that would speak about what should a Christian attitude be to these kind of things that we're talking about here. But verse 20 just simply says, but ye have not so learned Christ. In other words, that's not how you learned to follow Christ. So that verse in itself just destroys the whole argument of like, oh well, Paul says in Romans 7 that he can't stop sinning, and and he's a hypocrite, and here Paul is saying, look, you haven't learned to follow Christ by living like this, by living in sin. You didn't learn this kind of lifestyle, this kind of casting off restraint and indulging in uncleanness and sort of sexual sin. You didn't learn that from Christ. That's what the Gentiles who don't have Christ do. You haven't learned from Christ to walk in darkness, or to walk in ignorance, or to change the natural use into that which is against nature, as we read. To give yourselves over to lasciviousness, to give yourselves over to uncleanness, to live in the vanity of your mind like worldly people do. You haven't learned that from Christ, and that's not how you learned Christ. I think such a clear call for the Christian to walk in holiness, without which no man shall see the Lord. And it's like, as a church, that is our calling. Now, I'm not saying we always get it right, we always do that. People wrestle with all kinds of things, and when they come into our church, they might be carrying with them burdens and sins that the besetting sins that they're struggling with. So I'm not saying, show us your kind of certificate of righteousness before you come into this church, but like that is the goal. That's what we are aiming for, is to walk in the way that we have learned Christ. He is our example. He is the one that we want to imitate. And therefore, I put it this way, like there's so many churches that say, that they follow Christ, we're Christians, we follow Jesus. But like a while ago, we went as a family to Manchester Cathedral, just mainly for kind of architectural and historical reasons rather than spiritual reasons, But anyway, we kind of like a look around an old church. So I went to the cathedral in Manchester. Normally Church of England churches have like the English flag, the cross of St. George flying. But this one had like the rainbow flag flying from the top of the cathedral, And it's like taking what Ephesians 4 says, there's no way we can have fellowship with somebody who endorses and celebrates that. There's no way, it's like that's not how we learned Christ, and so that's just one example, but tying in with Romans chapter 1. But it's like, we have to make it clear that we cannot endorse or have fellowship with people who embrace uncleanness and immorality and and lasciviousness, because why? Because they have had their understanding darkened and they are alienated from the life of God through the ignorance that is in them. And that's what Paul's saying. So, take hold of these words, understand them. These are clear. This is clearly Paul imploring us to walk and live in holiness, to separate ourselves, and since we are Gentiles, those of us that are gathered here, from those other Gentiles, from Gentiles who do live like that, or even who excuse people who live like that, or applaud people who live like that. We are to be separate from that. That's not how we learned Christ, and therefore he's to be our example. It's a clear call to me, I think, to walk in the Spirit and not in the flesh, to walk even as Jesus walked, and also it's an affirmation of the power of God that He will enable us to do that. And that's very important, isn't it? Not to just say, right, you should be doing this, because that's no good. It's no good just telling somebody you must do this, because that's what the law does, doesn't it? It says, right, this is what you should be doing, but it doesn't actually give you the power to do it. But to understand that Christ in me, when Christ lives in me by His Spirit, He now enables me to walk in holiness. He now is enabling me to walk in victory and to overcome temptation. That the power of God will enable us to do that, since God has, as Peter says, given unto us all things that pertain unto life and godliness through the knowledge of Him that have called us to glory and virtue. So that's the exact opposite, isn't it, of the kind of philosophy of, well, don't expect to overcome sin until you die. So yeah, a friend of mine was telling me about John Fletcher. You might have heard of him. He was a friend of John Wesley's. He's kind of known as the theologian of the Methodist movement. But he kind of talks about those who say that, you're just going to live a life of sin. Really, there's nothing you can do about it. But it doesn't really matter, because when you die, that'll be all gone and you'll be in heaven. And he calls these people, he says they're guilty of death purgatory. In other words, they're teaching that death purges you of your sin instead of the blood of Christ or the Holy Spirit helping you overcome sin, which is a fair point. It's like, well, how come death can do what the Holy Spirit and the blood of Christ can't do. It's like what you're doing is insulting God. You know, there is power, resurrection power in God through Christ. You know, there's Holy Spirit power in us whereby we can overcome temptation, we can overcome besetting sins, and we can live a life that is different to those other I don't know what that is. That's it, isn't it? Other Gentiles, those other Gentiles, you know, and that's you know, we want to be different to that. You know, we don't want to be walking in darkness, in the vanity of our mind, in lasciviousness, working all uncleanness with greediness. It's like, no, that's not the Christian life, is it? And therefore, you want to discover this life that others have lived in the past, and that maybe others living even in the present, a life of power in God, a life where, you know, I don't want to be falling constantly and having to come to God and ask for forgiveness. You know, I want to be victorious, and I want to learn how to do that. And I think the answer is that it comes at a cost, you know, and it comes at a cost of us laying down our lives on the altar of God, and yielding to His Spirit. But, you know, hey, I can't think of a better thing to do with our lives here on earth than yielding wholeheartedly to our God and our Father, you know. So let's do that. Let's learn to do that, and let's throw ourselves upon Him.